Well, thank you everyone for joining this webinar, wherever you are joining us from. The goal of this webinar is to launch the report that is KfW Irresponsible Banking. The report is authored by the Coalition for Human Rights and Development and endorsed by 20 civil society groups and focuses on projects financed by the KfW, which is a German public development bank. The report reveals that despite claiming to improve economic, social, and environmental living conditions across the globe, the bank is actually fueling conflict in many regions and being complicit in serious human rights violations. The findings of the report showed that the KfW projects are often imposed without informing or consulting affected communities, and then those who raise concern or oppose such projects end up facing reprisals. So I will first call Dalili to the floor. Dalili, you are the main author of this report, so I wanted to ask you to first give us some short introduction on the report, an overview, what are the key arguments, why this report, why this bank, and what were the main findings.
Thank you very much, Sofia. Thank you, everyone, for your participation. So the report is about the international operations of KfW, which is a German public development bank founded in 1948, owned by the federal government of Germany and its federal states. It is one of the world's largest public development banks owned by a single country, and that's one of the reasons why we decided to publish this report. And as of 2024, for example, KfW had a total investment volume of just under 113 billion euros. 34 billion corresponds to international investments. And for comparison, the African Development Bank, which is the largest multilateral development finance institution in the African continent, had financial commitments of about 10 billion euros in 2023. And we received, in addition to the volume of investments, the huge volume of investments, of international investments from this bank, we received a disproportionate number of cases of reprisals coming from this bank. The coalition receives cases of reprisals from people affected by development projects in different parts of the world, and a disproportionate number of cases were coming from people affected by projects funded by this bank. That's why we decided to do a report about this and document some of its practices. So the KfW group is composed of three main business units. Two operate within Germany and Europe, while KfW Development Bank works outside Europe. And KfW Development Bank finances investments and provides advisory services abroad. Its priority areas are social development, environmental and climate protection, climate change adaptation, and the conservation of natural resources. And the KfW group includes two subsidiaries that operate internationally: the KfW IPEX Bank, and this is the group's largest subsidiary responsible for export and project finance, and its mandate is to promote the German export industry, and the German Investment Corporation, DEG, and this is a smaller subsidiary that supports the private sector under the goal of promoting social justice, human rights, and ecological and economic sustainability. So the report is focused on KfW Development Bank, IPEX Bank, and DEG. As a public law institution, in the context of its international investment, KfW is expected to comply with German laws and regulations, as well as international laws and treaties ratified by the country. As it is wholly owned by the German government, the state's extraterritorial human rights obligations apply to the bank's activities, and under international law, KfW should respect the rights to freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association, the right of access to information, and the rights of indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent.
La liberté d'expression et d'autres droits
legales de intervenir y dar remedios para los activistas en el contexto de sus actividades.
Germany adopted a law on human rights
remedy terhadap
of business enterprises, which also applies to the KfW group. So what we did in this report is, through 3 case studies and a review of the relevant policies, we analyzed how KfW Group is failing to mitigate and address the reprisal risk faced by people who oppose or raise concerns about the projects that the bank is financing internationally. The first section is an analysis of some aspects of its policies, guidelines, and principles. In particular, we analyze here the policies related to reprisals, social and environmental impact assessments, participation, stakeholder engagement, the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples, the disclosure of information, and the complaint mechanisms. And in the second part of the report, through 3 emblematic case studies of projects funded by KfW in Indonesia, Tanzania, and Mexico, the report shows how the lack of adequate policies and their poor implementation is heightening the risk of reprisals against human rights offenders. So the cases cover different sectors. In a geothermal power plant in Indonesia, an ammonia plant in Mexico, and a graphite mine in Tanzania. In the case of Indonesia, the loan was granted to a publicly owned company, and in the other 2, the client is a private company. These case studies are not a representative sample, but they are just emblematic examples identified on the basis of different criteria such as geographical and sectoral diversity, availability of information, type of client, etc. And finally, the report presents a set of recommendations developed in consultation with civil society actors and human rights offenders on policy improvements, practical steps, and procedures that the bank and its subsidiaries should adopt in order to prevent, address, and remedy reprisals in the context of its operations. I can start sharing some of the key findings of the report if I have time. Yes, okay. Okay. So on paper, KfW claims it is committed to improving economic, social, and environmental living conditions across the globe. But our analysis of its policies and the case studies presented shows that the bank is failing to prevent and address negative impacts of the environmental, social, and civil rights of the communities it is supposed to benefit. And in particular, it is not able to ensure that defenders and communities can safely raise their concerns and advocate for their rights, as the bank is not adequately identifying and mitigating reprisal risk for defenders. So based on our policy analysis and our analysis of the case studies, we see that despite implementing projects in highly conflicted contexts, the bank has not shared policies explaining how it assesses reprisal risks and how it prevents and responds to incidents of retaliations in the context of its projects. This is essential to ensuring that assessments are conducted with the free and safe participation of the people affected and to avoid potential negative impacts of the projects. The bank makes a general reference to the application of World Bank and IFC standards, but it is unclear to what extent this referral to these other policies also includes application of their standards and protocols and procedures on reprisals. So there is a lack of an appropriate policy about retaliations, explaining how the bank will assess reprisal risk, how it will prevent reprisals, and how it will respond to cases of reprisals against people affected by the projects. In general, KfW safeguards are very general. They lack sufficient clarity and are very open to interpretation. They are supplemented by references to strong legal regulations and standards developed by other banks, multilateral development banks, but projects affected communities are left in the dark, and it is difficult for someone to understand exactly which standards apply to which project of different subsidiaries of the group and which are the relevant internal processes. So there is lack of clarity about the policies that they apply. Another finding we made is that although the bank claims it is transparent and the KfW group says it provides the greatest possible transparency about their work and that the regular report on the impacts of their activities on human rights and on their implementation of their human rights commitments in a transparent, understandable manner, in spite of that, a search of the bank's websites reveals a lack of comprehensive and relevant information about the projects. and some types of project documents that are regularly disclosed by some major multilateral banks are not published by KfW Development Bank and its subsidiaries. So in particular, documents at the project level are not disclosed by the bank. KfW's transparency commitments are super vague and broad, and they fail to indicate exactly which type of information and documents are disclosed, such as social and environmental impact assessments, the results of consultations with the affected communities, appraisal documents done by the bank. Additionally, as the information is not available in local languages, it is insufficient to ensure access to information on the project impacts. In particular, for example, the IPEX Bank transparency guideline does not meet national or international standards related to the right of access to information, since it requires the client's consent for the disclosure of any project-related information. Another finding is that the KfW group as a whole does not have an external independent complaint mechanism, only internal procedures that lack provisions to ensure independence. Only DEG has a complaint procedure that provides for some degree of independence, the ICM, which is shared with FMO and Proparco. Also, another finding is that KfW's environmental and social safeguards rely too heavily on the client to determine environmental and social risks, allowing the bank to shirk responsibility for harms caused in the context of its projects. That is something that happens often with many also multilateral banks, that they rely heavily on the clients, and the fact that they rely on the clients to do the risk assessment is particularly concerning when there are reprisals, because reprisals are generally carried out by the client itself or by third parties who are linked to the client and acting on their behalf. So that's a problem. And just to finish, in all the three cases, we find that an adequate human rights due diligence process could have helped the bank identify reprisal risks and mitigate them. In all of the cases, there were huge failures in consultation processes. There was no consultation at all, or when consultations were finally carried out, they had significant failures. There was a lack of free, prior, and informed consent of the affected indigenous communities who clearly rejected the projects. There was a lack of timely and relevant information about the projects in the local languages, and in all three cases, reprisals happened, and we will hear more about that during the session, but there were cases of detentions, physical attacks, threats. And we think that failures in human rights due diligence, such as deficiencies in consultations and lack of ethic of indigenous communities, the lack of consent, leads inevitably to conflicts and escalation of social tensions and reprisals against people opposing the projects. The German government, in our opinion, has not established effective policies to ensure its international operations financed through KfW comply with basic human rights due diligence obligations. The complete lack of transparency of the projects and this assessment is a serious obstacle to participation of the people who are unaware of key aspects of the projects. And the lack of consultation of indigenous communities is also and the lack of consent is a failure, a serious failure that leads to reprisals. So this is to begin. We can speak more later. Thank you very much, Sofia.
Thanks a lot, Dalili, for providing the overview of this report and also pointing out the problems in these processes and also the operations of the bank and also the failures, both in having adequate policies in place, but also in effectively implementing whatever it's published. So Dalili mentioned these three case studies in the report that zooms in specific projects. And now we will hear firsthand from defenders about the situation on the ground and the very concrete and very real impacts of these practices. So I will first call Claudia. Before I give you the floor, I will give a very brief context of the project. So This project is in Sinaloa, Mexico. It's a KfW IPEX bank that has invested $1.5 billion in the Topolobampo ammonia plant. The members of 4 Mayo-Yoreme Indigenous communities have opposed the construction of the plant since it was announced in 2013. However, the project moved forward and was implemented in violation of the indigenous community's right to free, prior, and informed consent. In a region that is already violent because of the presence of the organized crime, the project has further fueled attacks against human rights defenders. So, Claudia, I will ask you, and first I will ask you to speak slowly because we have the interpretation, and then to make sure they are able to interpret everything that you say. So my question to you, Claudia, is what can you tell us about the impacts, the social and environmental impacts that this project had in the community?
Dios en Chaniagua, que chamaleya, Inapo Claudia Susana Quintero Sandoval, o Huirapo Nejome. Buenos días, Dios los bendiga a todos. Yo soy Claudia Susana Quintero Sandoval, de la comunidad indígena de Ohuira. Es recordar, es asumir y es frustrante tener que volver a repetir todos los impactos, tanto sociales como ambientales, que esta planta ya está produciendo porque está en construcción dentro de un territorio indígena, Mayo-Yoreme, en la bahía de Ohuira, en Topolobampo, Ahome, Sinaloa. Han rellenado más de 22 hectáreas de humedal de importancia internacional, un sitio Ramsar, el sitio Ramsar 2025. Están invadiendo ilegalmente 202 hectáreas de zona costera que no permiten ser privatizadas, mas sin embargo están invadiéndolo. Es un humedal totalmente, como lo dije, están sobrepasando tanto leyes nacionales como tratados internacionales. Esta planta propone utilizar agua de la bahía del sitio Ramsar de la bahía de Ohuira, que es la bahía más somera, en la mayor profundidad tiene 5 metros. Entonces ellos pretenden ocupar el agua de la bahía para sus procesos, devolverla al mar 3 grados más, con un grado de salinidad mucho mayor. Entonces estamos hablando que pondrá totalmente en peligro el equilibrio de esa bahía, que es la bahía mucho menos resistente del sitio Ramsar. Pondría en juego las especies de pesca, que somos los que pescamos ahí en la bahía. Pondría en juego no solamente a eso, delfines, es un santuario de delfines, tiburones, especies en peligro de extinción como las tortugas, ballenas, aves, porque es zona de anidación, era zona de anidación donde la planta ahorita se está construyendo, era zona de anidación de aves migratorias y de aves con profunda relevancia internacional, porque hay aves que están ahí, que emigran y que están en protección especial. Entonces estamos hablando de que es un daño ecológico tremendo e irreversible no solamente para el medio ambiente a nivel local y nacional, si estamos hablando que es a nivel internacional, porque son humedales protegidos internacionalmente. Lo vuelvo a repetir, es un sitio Ramsar, es el sitio Ramsar 2025. El daño ecológico, la empresa pues pretende succionar agua. Es que lo miro, lo reafirmo y lo vuelvo a decir, hay frustración, hay sentimientos, hay cansancio ya por parte de ver toda la impotencia de lo que se está pasando dentro ahí. El sitio es un sitio sagrado para las comunidades originarias. Es un sitio de pesca, tanto de subsistencia como de pesca comercial, para más de 4,000 pescadores. Estamos hablando de 4,000 familias que se quedarían sin el 60% de producción pesquera. Entonces, estamos hablando que derivará entonces un conato social de que se van a acabar la subsistencia económica de 4,000 familias de pescadores. Entonces, el impacto social sería tremendo y devastador para las comunidades indígenas. Nos están llevando a un etnocidio, a eso, a tener que salirnos por tener que buscar, en dado caso, qué vamos a hacer. Entonces, el daño social es demasiado. La empresa llega, entra, divide las comunidades y entonces el tejido social ya está fragmentado. Mi comunidad, la comunidad de mis hermanos ya no es la misma. Vivimos en la zozobra y vivimos en la penumbra, porque no sabemos el día de mañana qué va a pasar. Nos están dejando en una zona de riesgo. Entonces, el daño ecológico que esta planta pretende al momento es irreversible dentro de la bahía. Hay estudios del CIDIR de aquí de Sinaloa que dice que bajará más del 60% de la producción de especies pesqueras. Es demasiado. ¿Qué vamos a hacer? ¿De qué vamos a vivir? Aparte de eso, los gases que van a emanar no tienen, ellos mismos dicen en su estudio de ASOF, ellos dicen que es irremediable, que va a haber diferentes y muchas fugas mortales en el transcurso de su operación. Y una de las más mortales puede ser que la nube tóxica tenga alrededor a 45 kilómetros. Y en 15 kilómetros va a haber muerte y destrucción. De 15 kilómetros en adelante van a poder evacuar. Pero en 15 kilómetros, que somos las comunidades que estamos dentro de la bahía, no vamos a subsistir, no vamos a poder sobrevivir si esa fuga pasa. Pero aún así, ellos dicen en su estudio de ASOF, en su página 11 y 13, que es irremediable, que va a haber diferentes fugas en el transcurso de su procedimiento que van a ser mortales. Entonces, digo yo, ¿cómo es posible que nos quieran poner en esa zona de sacrificio a las comunidades originarias, a las comunidades indígenas?
Muchísimas gracias, Claudia. Bueno, paso al inglés. Thank you for sharing this very concrete impacts that you have been experiencing in the around because of this project, and also not only highlighting the environmental impact, but also the very human dimension of this implementations and how it's been damaging and harming indigenous communities and their ancestral territories. Before I ask you a little bit about reprisals, I will now bring Jimmy. We're going to another project in another part of the world. This is another KfW funded project. So this project in Indonesia is the expansion of the Olombo geothermal power plant in Poco Leok, Indonesia. It is important to highlight that this first phase of this project back in 2013 had already severe socio-environmental impacts on communities. However, the KfW approved a loan to expand the already harmful geothermal plant. And this project is displacing local indigenous communities and threatening to destroy their sacred sites, way of life, and the environment. The community has voiced their opposition to the project, and in response, they were repressed by police and military forces who have violently attacked and criminalized activists and human rights defenders. In the report, there is this phrase that struck me, that one community member mentioned that if the bank continues supporting this project, it is complicit in slowly murdering the people of Poco Leok. So, Jimmy, I want to ask you, the same question. Can you tell us a bit more about the impact of this KfW funded project that impacts that the communities have faced?
Terima kasih, Sofia. Sebelum saya masuk dalam paparan dampak situasi lingkungan hidup dan
Thank you,
sosial.
Sophia. Before I come to the social environmental impact, I'm a Ginting. I'm an advocate and also a researcher about the issue about human rights and also democracy. I'm in Pocok Leok, started from October 2024 until today, and today I'm still in Manggarai Regency. And I'm also supported by Pocok Leok community and also other community from Baca Aksara, Polisa.com, and also with Mining Community Alliance and also other alliance. Pocok Leok, in a big picture, Pocok Leok is a region surrounded by hills. So if we can imagine like a bowl, so the residents of the Pocok Lek is in the middle of the bowl. So Pocok Lek has population around 2,000 people. The texture of the soil in Pocok Leok is easy for us, sort of like landsliding. So in July 2025, we conducted field visit and we found that more than 15 landsliding spots in Pocok Leok. And actually, the geothermal exploration in Pocok Leok has started in 2017 unilaterally. So the government of Indonesia mentioned this island as geothermal island. So this encourages a big exploitations happen in all Flores area. There are hundreds spots for geothermal exploration that will be conducted by the government through PTPLN or the state-owned electricity, biggest state-owned electricity or power company in Indonesia. In Pocok Leok, the environment situations, as I mentioned before, so it's very fragile, very vulnerable to landslide, but in some project, in the existing project in Ulumbu 56, there are some rusted roof, and we also get a report where people get dizzy because they breathe H2S or sulfate acid. And we also have to understand the philosophy of the Pocok Leok indigenous community. They have the life philosophical that is really related to their life about the water source, garden, the cemetery, and there's also several the place for the spirituals things. In Pocok Leok, actually, there are several spots, like 6 spots, and 4 spots have been released and dominated by PLN. So this releasing process created pro and con due to this project, and this project also splitted some community are pro and some are contra, and this also impacted to their social life. So their relations was initially in harmony, but then they like separate, and they don't even greet each other in the last 3 years. So even like their blood, biological brothers and sisters, because they have like this dispute due to this project. This project is initially at the exploration stage. So it's not in the exploitation stage. It means that it's on the land releasing process, but the impact for the Pocok Leok community is really significantly negative. And this is what is felt by Pochocleo community. So their life, initially they are visiting each other, but then they don't do that. Even like in the important or traditional event, they don't come to see each other. They don't gather for the traditional event. It means that if this continuously happens, their entities as an indigenous community will be threatened because they lose their access to their culture. Not to mention their access to land. The land that initially agreed as a communal or joint land, today they assume that as their personal or private land. So this is actually to support the process for releasing the land. And there's also significant changes related to cultural, where there is a contrast by the emerging of new leaders who don't get the legitimacy from their community. So this has become the basis for those corporations to get the approval for their project. While I think that's all, Sophia, that I can share. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. For give us this insight and first-hand account on the impacts, the health impacts on communities, and also how this project has been violating the rights of indigenous communities and their connection to the land and nature, which is also something we heard from Claudia that's happened in Mexico. And it's also surprising, not surprising, but it's shocking to see that this is only the exploration phase. So we can only imagine that this impact will be aggravated as the project continues. So Claudia, I'm going back to you. You mentioned this, we touched upon this already. I wanted you to tell us a little bit about the reprisals. So you talked about the impacts of the project, but I wanted to ask you, how was this process? Were the communities consulted? Was there any process like this in place? Did you participate in it or not? And what were the impacts? What were the results of this participation? Can you tell us a little bit about the reprisals in opposing the project and how this has been developed?
Yeah. Look, we've been fighting and litigating for 11 years. It's been also a fight in court. We went to all the possible places that allowed us to.
Hasta la Suprema Corte de Justicia. Ellos comenzaron sus trabajos sin consultarnos previamente. Después de muchos años de litigio, llegamos a la Suprema Corte, nos dijeron que sí teníamos derecho a ser consultados, pero ellos ya habían impactado la zona, ya habían rellenado y ya habían puesto naves de administración de la empresa. Para ese entonces y todo ese tiempo que duró los litigios hasta que la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación dijo que sí teníamos derecho a ser consultados, para entonces la empresa ya había entrado a las comunidades a dividir, a fragmentar ese tejido social y esa cosmovisión que tenemos los yoremes de cuidar la naturaleza. Entonces dividen, y las represalias dentro de las comunidades han sido muchas. Muchas, las más graves, pues las amenazas directas de muerte a nuestros compañeros y a mí. Cuando se iniciaron los procesos de consulta, donde las comunidades que estábamos amparadas no consentimos, no dimos el consentimiento para la instalación. Entonces, están todavía violentando y violando tratados internacionales porque no No fuimos consultados previa, libre e informadamente y mucho menos de buena fe porque tuvimos que luchar para que nos consultaran. Ya no fue de buena fe. Tuvimos unos litigios y juicios por más de 6 años. Entonces, ya violentaron las leyes internacionales y tratados nacionales. Entonces, a eso súmenle que estamos amenazados de muerte, los que estamos más visibles en la lucha, porque no solamente somos nuestros compañeros, son 4 comunidades que estamos en lucha y 4 comunidades que no le dimos el consentimiento a la instalación de la planta. Una planta de amoníaco que pretende producir 2.200 toneladas métricas diarias. Pretende almacenar 75.000 toneladas de almacenaje ahí, en un punto donde ni a 6 metros, 8 metros está la primera comunidad. 75.000 toneladas. Entonces, ¿cómo hemos sufrido las represalias nosotros? Amenazas de muerte directa. Tenemos que vivir como si fuéramos los presos, como si fuéramos los delincuentes, encerrados en rejas, cuando vivíamos libres, cuando nosotras las comunidades vivíamos libres. Yo tengo que vivir, yo y mis hijos, tenemos que vivir como presos y los hijos de mis compañeros. Tenemos que traer un botón que nos están diciendo y que tenemos que decir dónde andamos. Un chaleco antibalas. Vivir en la zozobra ya no solo de que van a llegar y me van a matar, sino que voy a vivir en la zozobra si se llega a construir esa planta. Vivir en la zozobra de acostarme una noche y no amanecer, ni yo ni mis hijos, y toda mi comunidad. Porque ellos aceptan que nos vamos a morir en una fuga. Porque lo aceptaron. Entonces, ya no sé si es más fácil que me maten o dormir todas las noches pensando que un día no voy a despertar ni yo ni mis hijos. Ya hubo muchas represalias de la empresa. Vienen, dan dádivas, entran en la comunidad, dividen. Hay 2 gobernadores tradicionales, dividen las autoridades tradicionales, se meten como la humedad y eso pasa y ha habido conatos de violencia. Yo he sido golpeada dentro del centro ceremonial donde hacemos nuestros usos y costumbres. He sido golpeada. Mi hijo menor de edad fue golpeado, fue violentado, pero aún así seguimos porque el futuro de las nuevas generaciones, de las comunidades originarias, merecemos vivir bien. No merecemos tener una empresa que nos tiene en una zona de riesgo y sacrificio. Creo que podría decir mucho de los impactos sociales, ambientales, los de riesgo mortal, pero creo que el impacto comunitario no se cuantifica. El impacto mental y desgaste mental que puede tener uno por luchar por el futuro mejor tampoco se cuantifica. Ustedes pueden cuantificar la inversión de dólares, pero yo no puedo cuantificar el dolor y frustración que sentimos de ver que el futuro se nos está arrebatando. Yo no lo puedo cuantificar, como ustedes cuantifican la inversión. Es todo.
Muchísimas gracias, Claudia, por compartir tu historia y compartir estos impactos. Sabemos que no es fácil hablar y seguir hablando sobre esto. Y cuando ustedes lo sienten muy concretamente en la piel, todos estos impactos, no solo económico, pero eso que nos has contado del impacto en las comunidades, de cómo eso se deshace. Entonces, muchísimas gracias por estar acá y compartir esto, tu historia. Y voy al inglés ahora de nuevo. And also thank you for highlighting how the community had to go to courts to ensure a right that it's their own, that they belong, and how these processes are long, and also how the companies often use these lengthy procedures to then divide communities in a dividing and conquering strategy. So yes, thank you for sharing this with us. Jimmy, I'm going back to you and also asking you the same question. Can you tell us a little bit about the reprisals the communities have faced when opposing the projects, and what has been happening to defenders and activists and leaders in this context?
Ya, saya akan bicara dalam dua hal, yaitu reprisal dan terkait dengan proses FPIC. Di dalam reprisal itu sendiri, kami menemukan
Itself, we found that in October 2024 until March 2025, there are 35 indigenous people who are in reprisals. 9 of them are women and 25 are male. And there are 12 cases that repeatedly happen at the same people. In terms of those who are doing this reprisal are from military and also from police, who are always coming with the reason to secure the projects, to secure the national strategic project. Even like journalists who also conducted or performed violations, and also journalists who cover the news in the field. But it also not included the actions in 5th June 2025. There are hundreds of indigenous people who got a negative response from the regent, the head of the local government, intimidating and also threatened their own community when their communities demonstrated that oppose the decree of the geothermal locations in their territory. Because on December 2022, the determining of that locations is not through proper consultations, and they're just aware that their territory, their housings are the locations for developing geothermal project. From the reprisals that accepted by the community are like physical intimacy and criminalizations, and also the injustice on administrative, and also stigmatizations. The Pocokle community is perceived as stupid community. They don't receive the development and anti-government. But the fact is they really support the development. The geothermal power plant, the existing one, they take the water source from Pocokleok. Means that since long time ago, they support this development. But because this enters their territory, of course they have right. They are entitled to raise their voice, whether they agree with the project or not. But the process of these consultations in the FPIC context is full of manipulations. We got many reports coming from the companies how their companies manipulate the FPIC process. And from the community's perspective, actually they have conveyed this multiple times. It is important to note that the community has protested 30 times of actions. At the same time, KfW didn't see this, and they didn't even give loan to PLN for this geothermal power plant. So it really hurts the community. From our findings, because the actions continuously happens, and also the campaigns on the advocacy of the violence that happened to the Pochokle community. So in September 2024, KfW assigned the independent consultants to observe what happened in Pochokleok in the context of PIC. And the findings also aligns and also resonates with what the community stated. It means that there is a violations, there is a procedure that they violate related to FPIC. But KfW attitude is really disappointing because KfW is not strictly it's not strictly on the findings. KfW just suggested this project delayed for a while and there will be another FPIC or what they should do. What kind of FPIC that they should do, because majority of community rejected this project. At the end, in today's situation, the government starts to conduct big or mass socializations, but not in Pochokleok. It happens in other cities, like in Jakarta, Yogyakarta, not in Pochokleok. In July 2025, there is a visit from the governor to listen to the complaints from the community. But till today, the indigenous people of Pochokleok is really under pressure. They live under uncertainty. And for the updates, me and my advocates colleagues, we conducted a administrative complaint through the attitude of the regent who intimidating the indigenous people who conducted demonstration last 5th of June. And we hope that this kind of actions like violation, intimidation, or threatening is not going to happen anymore. And even this is done by the head of the local government. This doesn't make sense if it happens to human, it happens to their people. And we hope that this can be a mitigations measure in the future. If the indigenous people of Pochokleok raise their voice, they should be protected and they should be listened very well. Unfortunately, till today, there is no response in relation to the KfW behavior toward regarding their funding in Flores. So KfW is not only in Pochokleok but also in other regency. So that's all, Sophia, from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. And also, yes, it's striking to see that these processes repeat themselves in different regions. You mentioned the consultations that are manipulated, and that also the division of communities, and also the relevance of ensuring that whoever joins consultations, they are secure, so that we actually have safe and meaningful consultations of communities for any project. So thank you for sharing these. We will now have the video from Pichamon that she sent to us. So while Lorena set this up, I just wanted to flag that I didn't in the beginning. There is a Q&A function that you can use to ask some questions. After this video, we're going back to the panelists to have some reflections on what's coming. And also, so if you have any questions you want to ask, please do put it in the Q&A that we can also ask to the participants. So Lorena, go ahead.
Colleagues, friends, thank you very much for inviting the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights to be part of this important occasion. Development finance institutions, both bilateral and multilateral, play a unique role in shaping the pathways of development. They do not simply provide capital, they can set norms, influence priorities of governments, and send strong messages about what kind of development is valued and how it should be achieved. That is why the responsibility of development finance institutions, or DFIs, to uphold human rights and to ensure access to remedy when harms occur is not optional. It is central to their legitimacy and effectiveness. The UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights has underlined this in its thematic report to the Human Rights Council on DFIs and human rights. The report makes clear that DFIs are not neutral actors. By financing projects, whether in infrastructure, energy, agriculture, or social services, they directly and indirectly shape the lives of communities. With this power comes responsibility to prevent human rights abuses, to respect international standards, and to build systems where people can seek remedy if harms occur. Why is this so important? Well, first, because development without rights is not true development. A project that brings electricity but displaces communities without consent, that builds roads but silences environmental human rights defenders, that funds growth but fuels inequality, such projects undermine the very goals of inclusive and sustainable development. Second, DFIs are, as I mentioned previously, uniquely placed to model good practice. Their governance structures often include states, or really usually include states. Their mandates are tied to public interest, and their operations influence private finance. If DFIs embed the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into every decision, from project appraisal through to their exit strategies, they can set a standard that ripples across markets and across sectors. But upholding human rights is not only about prevention, it is also about timely and effective remedy. The working group has stressed time and time again that remedy cannot be an afterthought. Effective grievance mechanisms that are accessible, transparent, and trusted by affected communities are essential. These must not only exist on paper, but they must also deliver concrete outcomes for people whose rights have been harmed. Finally, all of this is fundamentally a matter of credibility as well. At a time when development finance is expanding to meet global challenges, from the climate transition to digital inclusion, DFIs must show that their investments are not only bankable, but rights-based. Doing so strengthens trust, reduces conflict, and ensures that development finance lives up to its purpose, that is, of advancing human dignity and a sustainable future. So the challenge before us is clear. DFIs must move from do no harm to also actively embedding human rights as a cornerstone of development practice. That means robust human rights due diligence, strong remediation frameworks, and independent accountability mechanisms, and genuine engagement with affected communities. So the message here is really simple. Financing development is not just about the flows of capital. It is about the justice, dignity, and human rights that must accompany these flows. Without this, development risks becoming extractive. But with it, development can be transformative. As chairperson of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, I commend the incredible work that the Coalition for Human Rights and Development has been doing to monitor development finance and call for its alignment with international human rights standards. This report being launched today represents yet another publication that will help augment much-needed understanding of the challenges of development finance today and what's needed to safeguard human rights now and into the future. Thank you very much again. I must apologize that I cannot join you in person as I'm about to board a flight, but I very much appreciate this opportunity to engage with the coalition and your members, and I look forward to engaging with you further on this and other topics.
This is great. Great that she shared this message with us. And I also think that it's quite interesting to see what banks and how banks should act and what they should do. And then on the other side, we have these defenders, Jimmy and Claudia, sharing very concrete stories that they're not what they're doing. So even the ultimate goal of this bank, of the KfW, to how is it to improve economic, social, environmental living conditions across the globe. This is not clearly it's not happening. So I will start with the question, and I'll go back because we do have a question in the chat, and I also think it connects with in the chat asking that how does it work? Mexico and Indonesia, do they have to sign contracts before the development bank can implement anything? And there's this comment that I thought the bank just makes the investments and give the lead to the countries. So can you explain, and also it goes a bit with the recommendations on what this bank should do to make sure that the projects they are financing are not impacting negatively communities and the environment.
¿Puedo contestar en español? Sí.
Yeah.
Bueno,
Well,
en realidad,
in
sí,
reality,
cambio mi canal, perdón.
I have to change the channel. In the case, the bank, what it does,
La obligación que tiene el banco es de cumplir sus propias políticas, por supuesto, y esas políticas tienen que estar en línea con los compromisos internacionales de derechos humanos. Como se trata de un banco estatal, el banco tiene que, al decidir sus inversiones, en su proceso de decidir en qué va a invertir o qué tipo de proyectos va a financiar, tiene que cumplir con esos compromisos. Nosotros no sabemos en detalle los procesos internos de los bancos que estamos analizando acá, de las filiales de KfW, precisamente porque es muy poco transparente en cuanto a algunos de sus procesos internos para evaluar los riesgos y los impactos de los proyectos. O para evaluar, por ejemplo, las consultas y la participación de las personas afectadas cuando en el marco del proyecto. No sabemos con detalle los procesos internos del banco, pero sí sabemos que tienen compromisos en sus políticas de cumplir con derechos humanos y en las leyes y en los tratados internacionales que suscribió Alemania tienen que cumplir con los derechos humanos, y eso requiere evaluar en forma previa a aprobar cualquier proyecto cuáles son los impactos sociales y ambientales de esos proyectos, dar participación a las personas afectadas y asegurar el consentimiento informado de las comunidades indígenas cuando estas son afectadas por sus proyectos. Y si las comunidades indígenas dicen no, tienen que retirarse y no financiar el proyecto. Eso es lo que las políticas bancarias lo que tienen que asegurar es eso, es que si hay una comunidad afectada que está diciendo no al proyecto, el banco no debería financiar ese proyecto. Pero los que firman los contratos es el banco y el cliente del banco. En el caso de una empresa, cuando el cliente es una empresa privada, lo firman con la empresa privada. Aunque en muchos casos también se requiere por el tipo de proyecto la autorización, ciertas autorizaciones ambientales. También hay ciertos procesos de autorización que se requieren para ciertos proyectos. Y que también en los casos que documentamos hay deficiencias en esos procesos, y Claudia posiblemente pueda ampliar más sobre cuáles son las deficiencias que hubo a lo largo del proceso de autorización del proyecto de la planta de amoníaco, por ejemplo, en México. Pero así de manera general, esa es creo, la respuesta a cómo funciona, digamos. El contrato se firma con el cliente, pero eso no quiere decir que las personas afectadas no tengan que participar. Tienen que participar, y en el caso de las comunidades indígenas, si no hay consentimiento para avanzar con el proyecto, deberían retirarse y no financiarlo. Eso en base a compromisos, a lo que establecen sus propias políticas en realidad. Y las leyes que el Estado alemán tiene que cumplir.
Gracias, Dali. Claudia, te voy a hacer una pregunta ahora. Tenemos en el chat una pregunta si ustedes han contactado al banco o algún sector del banco, o el ombudsperson o el director de sostenibilidad, y si han obtenido, y ahí yo agrego una pregunta, si han obtenido respuesta y cómo fue esa interacción con el banco, si lo intentaron. Sorry, do you hear everyone my question? Yes. Claudia, ¿me escuchas? Ah, no.
No
Ahora,
escuché, de hecho ni a Dalí le escuché.
¿y ahora me escuchas? ¿No? ¿No? ¿Me escuchas ahora?
Sí, no habíamos podido acceder a interactuar con el banco. De hecho, fuimos a la embajada alemana, mas no tuvimos respuesta. Entregamos unos oficios en su momento, pero no tuvimos respuesta. Interacción directa con el banco no hemos podido tener. Hoy es una gran oportunidad para que sepan que en el norte de Sinaloa, en las comunidades yoremes de la bahía de Oguira, su dinero está fragmentando mi vida y la de mi familia y mi comunidad. Pero no habíamos tenido para nada oportunidad. Tenemos 12 años de resistencia que hemos luchado solamente con la voluntad de Dios, de la naturaleza. Hemos llegado y hemos resistido. Pero hoy ha sido una gran oportunidad de que ellos realmente escuchen de viva voz cómo están las situaciones aquí en Sinaloa.
Muchas gracias. Y creo que tu respuesta también se conecta mucho con algo que es descrito en el informe, que las comunidades tienen cero o casi cero oportunidades y caminos y medios de contactar y hablar directamente con los bancos y sus directores y quién hace la aprobación de esos proyectos. Y eso es un gran problema. Y también sí, creo que este informe se va a difundir y se va a mandar a los bancos y a quien lo debe leer para que sepan de lo que pasa y que tengan chance de corregir sus actos. Bueno, now turning to English now. I want to go to very concrete asks and recommendations. So I will start, Jimmy, I will start with you. Then I will go to Claudia, and then I'll ask Dalili about the reports. So, Jimmy, if you had the chance to talk to the board of directors of the bank and whoever approves and manages this project, what would be your concrete asks for the banks? Like, what would you like, you and the communities that you've been working with would like to ask the bank?
Ya, kami tidak akan lagi menanyakan terkait dengan bank
anymore to the bank, but the bank should understand that Pocoleok, indigenous people's standpoint is to resist this project. The community demands that KfW to stop the financing to the project to the company, and that is non-negotiable. Second, we will also force KfW to conduct due diligence in regards with the situation, incidents in the field, and the facts, not only in Pocoleok, but also in all Flores Islands, where they would have investment plan. Number three, the last but not the least, we would like KfW to immediately release their position openly through announcement about this project, because the people have been tired, yeah, in going through dialogues and everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jimmy. I will pose now the same question to you, Claudia. What would you like to ask directly from the KfW in terms of this project or the impact that you have been sharing with us?
I would ask, I feel like my brother of same fight and struggle on Indonesia. No, I don't want to ask anything. I want to remind them their bank norm guidelines. They say they have respectful funding with society, with the environment, but that respectful funding in the communities is not taking place at all. It is not like that. Just tell them, I would tell them, they have guidelines of not funding projects in indigenous communities or protected areas with investment where they have like toxic materials such as ammonia. Something that affect and that don't have a free, prior, and informed consent with a good faith in other communities. They do not have to fund projects that are being totally illegal in forbidden areas, in Ramsar areas, in protected areas internationally. Rather than asking them, it's just to remind them their own guidelines. They should be respectful bank and have respectful funding. We want a better life. And really, we do want a healthy environment for ourselves, for the community, not only for the outsider. This KfW and the funding to Proman Enterprise, who's Swiss government, are not meeting their own guidelines that they claim. So there's no question. It's just a start of despair and stop funding these projects that are threatening our life, our health, and the environment.
Diligence process, respect to existing laws and policies and compliance with them, and also upholding international human rights standards, and also transparency about the projects, about the financing, about the processes. So with this, I will turn to you, Dalile, because I do think that they are very much aligned with the recommendations that are made in the report. So can you tell us a bit about the clear recommendations that the report brings? You're muted.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, in the report you can find more detailed recommendations specifically about reprisals, transparency, safeguards compliance, participation, and accountability. I will mention some key parts of these recommendations, which are very much aligned with what was mentioned before. So one of the key recommendations is that the bank should develop and implement policies, protocols, and guidelines regulating how it will assess and mitigate reprisal risk before project approval, and how to respond and remedy reprisals when they happen. These recommendations these regulations, this guidance should be developed in consultation with CSOs, and particularly those specializing in security of human rights offenders and groups affected by reprisals in the context of development projects. So these regulations should clearly communicate that the bank has zero tolerance for reprisals against those who criticize or oppose its projects, and that the bank will not proceed with investments where it cannot ensure that affected communities are able to raise their concerns safely and without fear of reprisals, including through suspension or cancellation of disbursements. And it should also detail these protocols, the steps and components of KfW's own due diligence processes aimed at assessing country and project-specific retaliation risks. So it should make an analysis of contextual risks, civic space restriction, for example, in the area where they are operating, or social conflicts in the area that could be exacerbated by the project. The bank should carry out the contextual risk assessment and a project-specific assessment, and also the bank should commit to respond to incidents of reprisals in the context of its projects, and it should state clearly how it will respond to reprisals. It should inform about which protocols are in place to deal with reprisals when they happen, who can be contacted at the bank to deal with the reprisals issues, what kind of measures these areas can adopt. So the process for dealing with reprisals should also be published in the website. And the reprisal risk assessment should be independently carried out by the bank as part of the project risk analysis and categorization. So that should be one of the key components of the risk categorization of the projects. And it should not rely on the client. So the client should not be doing its own reprisal risk assessment. It should be carried out independently by the bank. And it should, of course, the bank the protocol should assess how indigenous peoples are affected and other groups in marginalized situations that may be particularly at risk, for example, women, persons with disabilities, and also assess, for example, relevant allegations and cases of corruption, which may heighten the risk of reprisals. When those allegations occur, in our experience, the reprisal risk heighten. So the part of the contextual risk assessment should include those considerations, and conduct, of course, litigation due diligence on implementing agencies or companies. So it should assess if the company's track record and any ongoing or past litigation that may signal conflicts with the communities or signal risk of retaliation. So these are the main components of the recommendations with regards to reprisals. Of course, we make a lot of recommendations about transparency, which is a huge gap in the bank policies and practices. And really, the bank is much behind other multilateral development banks. So it is key that they start publishing on their website. The bank publishes on its website all the relevant project documents, so people can understand clearly which are the impacts of the projects, how they can participate, what are the results of the consultations, what assessment is carried out by the bank, which are the appraisal documents of the project. All this information should be published proactively by the bank and in the local languages, so communities can really access the content. And those are the key recommendations. Of course, there is more about participation, which was like a huge non-compliance in the cases we reviewed. They should respect FPIC and should independently assess also if the company has the consent of the communities, because sometimes the participation mechanisms are implemented by the clients, and also often the financiers rely on the information provided by the client to assess whether there is participation or informed consent. So the bank should also have its own procedure to assess whether there is consent for the project, in particularly when there are affected indigenous communities. And the last is we also make recommendations about accountability mechanisms that BMC, which is the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, which oversees the bank, should establish an independent redressal system in line with the recommendations of the German Institute for Development Evaluation. And also, this is something that civil society organizations in Germany have requested. And these systems should address all grievances from project-affected people regarding state agencies and all the involved development cooperation actors, including KfW. So these are in summary, but there are more detailed recommendations on the report.
Dali, before I give the floor to Claudia and Jimmy for any final words that they have, we still have 9 minutes. I just wanted to, because we do have a question in the chat that also links to a question that I had. How does the KfW compare to other banks? So we mentioned like multilateral development banks, while this bank is a one country only bank. So can you briefly tell us how do they compare to each other? And also there's linking the question in the chat, it's about the commercial finance. So are we talking about commercial finance of a public bank instead of a development finance in this case? Can you briefly tell us a little bit about this?
Yes, we in terms of comparison with other banks, one of the key findings is that it is well behind other banks in terms of transparency, for example, and we compared in the report one project, for example, that is financed by KfW and by other multilateral development banks, and the other multilateral development banks have had much more information about the project than KfW, for example. That was one aspect where we compared. Then, with regards to policies more generally, they are less detailed and more vague in general. They are full of references to other policies like IFC, World Bank, etc. But it is not clear in which way they are implementing these policies, which aspects. And sometimes they cite several different standards and policies. So it's not clear at all really what standards they apply. So in the case of IPEX and KfW, they lack an independent accountability mechanism. So in that aspect, they also compare much. In the comparison, they seem to have lower standards in general. So that's the key issues that we compare, and we have seen that it's not. The report doesn't make a systematic comparison. It's just an analysis of KfW, but according to our experiences and looking at those key issues, we see a huge gap. And with regards to reprisals, for example, many other banks have published statements on reprisals. They have some of them have some guidance on their websites, for example, about how they assess reprisal risks. And so a lot of banks have more developed policies about this, even though no bank is perfect in this aspect. Really, like it's quite behind in terms of the strength of its policies in order to comply with human rights standards and that protect human rights defenders. So in that aspect, it is very, yes, it is much less developed.
Thank you, Dali.
I didn't understand another part of the question, really. Like there was some other part of the question that I didn't understand. I'm sorry.
No problem. I think you answered pretty much. So we still have 6 minutes. So I wanted to open the floor to either Jimmy or Claudia to see if you have any final reflections, any call for support for whoever is joining this webinar, or if there's anything else that you want to share. So maybe Claudia, you have your microphone open. So if you have any, yes, feel free to come in.
Pues yo creo que más que reflexión es un grito, no de Claudia, sino de todas las comunidades que estamos siendo afectadas, que estamos viviendo el principio del etnocidio para nosotros, porque vamos a ser desplazados por una empresa financiada por el banco. Creo que más que reflexión es ese grito desesperado de que volteen a ver que su dinero nos está matando en vida, nos está asfixiando la esperanza, pero estamos sobreviviendo. La reflexión para ellos sería que si se supone que ellos son una empresa o un banco respetuoso con el medio ambiente y la sociedad y más a las comunidades indígenas, ellos deberían de parar inmediatamente el financiamiento a la empresa Proman con su filial Gas y Petroquímica de Occidente, que pretende construir una planta que producirá 2.200 toneladas diarias de amoníaco y almacenará 75.000 toneladas en territorio indígena. Creo que más que reflexión, es una solicitud, y no es una solicitud descabellada o fuera de la norma que ellos manejan. Es el grito de las comunidades indígenas del norte de Sinaloa. Y más que me quieran decir que me van a reparar o resarcir el daño, porque el daño físico, emocional, no se repara. El daño a un futuro mejor tampoco se repara. Es mejor tener un futuro sostenible sin una empresa que produzca amoníaco.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Jimmy, I want to open also the floor to you for any final comments and reflections.
Ya, persetujuan di awal tanpa paksaan itu bukan sebuah jargon, tetapi itu merupakan kewajiban yang harus
Agreement with consent is a mandatory that must be fulfilled by all the parties in relations because it is related to the community within those areas. Therefore, KfW must be consistent with their attitude because when we met KfW, they stated that they really appreciate human rights, they respect human rights. Therefore, let's make the community as a subject, not the object of the development. So we have to be, it must be honest. They must get out from this project. If KfW doesn't aware that when the infrastructure happen, it will escalate the conflict, KfW must be responsible that there will be a violations that happen in the community. It means that KfW is part of the human rights violations. So the bank must withdraw from that project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me change my channel to make sure. Yeah, I think everyone hears me. So thank you very much. Please make sure you check the report, the full report. There's a lot of information there, and also the key recommendations. Share it widely. And I want to also especially thank our speakers, Dalile, but also mainly Claudia and Jimmy. Thank you for joining us in this report. We know the time zones are not the best for you to join. It's either too late or too early. So we really appreciate you taking the time to share your stories and your experience and your knowledge with us. We really appreciate that. Thank you again. And yes, thanks everyone. Yes, and if you have any additional questions, and I do realize there are some questions we didn't have the time to answer, please feel free to reach out, and we're happy to discuss any points and developments and collective actions. Thanks, everyone.